I understand going in that this book by Edmund Pincoffs is not an easy one. Pincoffs spent much of his career teaching in the state of Texas. He taught at the University of Houston and then finished off his career a few decades at the University of Texas in Austin. I hope through the conversations we have here and on the discussion board, we'll be able to get some value out of this book. I chose the book because of the way it cuts against the grain of modern ethical theories. You'll see in this first chapter that he's very upfront about that. He'll show you some of the ways he does that. A primary way, and you'll see it right there in his title, is his rejection of the normativity of reasoning from quandaries in ethical thinking. The famous trolley problem is an example of a quandary, a difficult situation that has no obviously satisfying answer. Well, unless you're a certain kind of utilitarian. If you're that kind of utilitarian, all you have to do is analyze the situation, pull out your universal principle. That might be something like, do that action which produces the greatest good for the greatest number, or a corollary of that, do that action which produces the least harm. You do that, and you have your answer. If pushing one fat man off a bridge to block the trolley will save 2 or more lives, well, then go for it. If you're dealing with the track diversion scenario, then divert to the track that kills the fewest people. Pincoffs finds this approach that relies on quandaries too reductionistic. I like that about his work. He gets the argument rolling by considering the complexities of our age. And remember, this book was published 1986. So take that into account when he talks about our age. He says, in a time when rapid change is everywhere in technology, especially medical, sexual mores, media-stimulated wants and expectations, social structure, natural environment, international relations, it is hardly surprising that there should be moral disorientation and a demand for whatever might be of use in achieving balance, reasoned consensus, common goals, common rules, and common understanding of what shape moral education should take. If rapid change was rampant in 1986, can't we say it has been even more so since then? Just in the past 20 years, have you noticed changes in the areas he mentions? Technology, sexual mores, media-stimulated wants and expectations. He's here pointing at the world of advertising and marketing. Social structure, the natural environment, international relations. Just consider that last example. When he wrote this book, we were still involved in the Cold War with the Soviet Union. As I write these notes, I'm following the news of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Any historian, however, can point to the fact of change throughout history. Change is normal. But consider the second half of Pincoffs' paragraph. When you look at the world around you, do you see any moral disorientation? Bite into that metaphor and chew on it a bit. What do we mean by orientation and disorientation? Back when I was young, I was in Boy Scouts. One of the things we did was to practice orienteering. We had a terrain map and a compass. We had to figure out where we were on the map, where on the map our objective was, and discern how to get across the terrain from where we were to that objective. If we couldn't locate ourselves on the map, we failed. We were disoriented. We couldn't find our objective. We failed. We were disoriented. If our compass was unreliable, one of our primary tools we used while we were in motion, we also failed. We again were disoriented. I remember one experience in particular. It was in the summer of 1978. We were hiking in the Texas Hill Country out of San Marcos. We'd done some bushwhacking. That is, we'd gotten off the trail and we're trying to get to our destination. We were also getting low on water and needed more. We finally got to a point where we could see a windmill off in the distance. We were able to use our map and determine where we were. We set out into the valley. There were several ridges between where we were and the windmill we were aiming at. Our scoutmaster used his compass to keep us on track. But when we topped the next ridge, we found that we were not on track. We had to reorient ourselves as we picked our way through the next valley. Again, topping the next ridge, we found ourselves off track. This happened several times. We couldn't understand how we were getting it wrong every time. We knew how to do this work of orienteering. We'd done it before. We finally figured out our problem. Our scoutmaster was holding his compass in the hand where he wore his Aggie ring, and the metal in the ring was throwing off the compass reading. Change is one of the things that can produce moral disorientation. If ethics is the inquiry into the nature of the good life and how to achieve it, cultural change affects both sides of the equation. It affects what we take to be the good life. Pincoffs mentions the change in morals and social structure. Later in this chapter, he'll highlight the increasing individualism of our culture. If individualism is the basic truth of what it means to be human, here we are back with considerations of philosophical anthropology, then the good life will likely be seen by some as maximizing the possibility for all individuals to determine completely on their own what is good for them. I'm not a subjectivist, so I think that such individualism, when taken to be the sole truth, is a form of moral disorientation. The other side of the equation is the how. How do we achieve the good life, whatever it might be? If pure autonomous individualism is the good, the method to achieve that might be strengthening the force of will so that individuals can stand firmly against heteronomy. Pincoffs continues. Even though philosophers have long discussed the problem of free will, the good for man, practical wisdom, the nature of justice, courage, and benevolence, ethical theory is essentially a modern invention. To say that one has a theory of ethics is to say, as that term is usually understood, that one has a systematic account of the foundation. We're going to run into that word again, the foundation of moral judgment. Theories are made to be applied to cases, to provide the principles and procedures by which moral problems can be resolved. I will argue that the structures known as ethical theories are more threats to moral sanity and balance than instruments for their attainment. They have these malign characteristics principally because they are, by nature, reductive. They restrict and warp moral reflection by their insistence that moral considerations are related in some hierarchical order. I will argue that there is no such order. Now, we could say much more here, but I want to limit my comments to one thing, the problem of certainty. The quest for certainty is not a new thing. In its most basic form, it's a normal part of human life everywhere as we seek to minimize the risks we take in life. In the modern era, however, the expectation that certainty is not just desirable, but possible has increased. We turn to the primacy of epistemology in modernity, foundationalism, and look for things we cannot doubt. If we're Cartesians, the indubitable truth upon which we build our certain knowledge will be our knowledge of our own existence. If we're empiricists, we may look for certainty in sense data and experience. Once we have our indubitable foundation in place, all we need is a reliable method to build our structure of knowledge upon that foundation. The challenge, seen repeatedly throughout the modern and now postmodern eras, has been that all those efforts have failed. Our indubitable foundations have proven to be susceptible to doubt. Our proven methods of building upon those foundations have also failed to work as advertised. One outcome of these failures has been a general skepticism. I'm sure you've encountered this skepticism attached to ethical thinking at some point in your lives. We start with the assumption that real knowledge is indubitable and thus absolutely certain, built properly on the sure foundation. But then with the failure of foundationalist epistemologies, we assume that there is no real knowledge. We fall into skepticism. If this were a course in epistemology, I would develop my response. But since it's not, I'll just point at it. My solution is the claim that our conception of real knowledge is flawed insofar as we think it has to be understood on the foundationalist metaphor. On page 3, Pincoffs says, there are mutually irreducible types of moral consideration, that there is no hierarchy with the king consideration at ease in the apex, no one principle system that incorporates all of the moral rules. Above all, in morals, we want to be able to reason from something solid, unquestionable, beyond debate. Look at the ethical theories that are available these days. The basic principles of each seem very simple. Deontological theories tell us to do what we ought to do. Rules are what are central. Consequentialist theories tell us to pay attention to the possible consequences of our actions, since consequences are what matter. Looking at consequentialist ethical systems like egoism, do that which is in your own self-interest, or utilitarianism, do that which results in the greatest utility for the greatest number, they get more specific as they deal with types of consequences. Divine command ethics, perhaps a variant of deontological ethics, says, do what God commands. Nice, simple, straightforward theories for us. Pincoffs sees ethics as more complicated than this. I'm in line with him on this. The pursuit of the good life likely requires all these kinds of considerations, as well as others not mentioned. I'd also go with him in saying that not only do we use multiple considerations, but that these considerations don't come in a set hierarchy that makes ethical thinking predictable in all situations. He continues, to reason morally is to weave a net, or if fallacies crop up, to mend a net. To decide rationally is to compare the joint strength of one set of considerations to the joint strength of alternative sets. Consider his image of a net. When you take your course on epistemology, you'll find something similar when you look at Quine's web of beliefs. The weaving he has in mind is not the kind of thing we sit down and do and finish before we get to the actual work of moral reasoning. No, our methodologies are a net that we're continually weaving and refining. They're always being tested as we use them, though the point of testing differs from situation to situation. Sometimes the net may fail. He mentions fallacies cropping up, and then the net will need repair. In the background here is the assumption that somewhere along the way, we develop the skills to identify fallacies when they occur. This is one of the aspects of moral reasoning that he insists must be cultivated. In an ethics class like this one, you will get some tools, maybe some fibers from which you can make the strands of your net. Most importantly, I hope you're cultivating skills at weaving and mending. He continues on this page with a subject I've given a fair amount of thought to, and once used as a writing assignment for this class. He says, some people will develop the kind of practical wisdom that will make their moral judgments especially worthy of respect. Others will not be good at moral reasoning through defects of character or intellect. But the polemical point is that there are no moral experts. There would be moral experts if the claims of ethical theory were true. There would be people who knew something that the rest of us do not know. They would know what the formula is by which we determine the difference between right and wrong. And they would know how best to apply it to cases that arise. Like experts in any field, we could divide our judgment of them into parts. We could acclaim their expertise while deploring their character. When I asked students to write on the possibility of moral expertise, most came to the conclusion that there were not moral experts. If there were moral experts, they'd say, people like famous moral philosophers would be in that category. When I responded to these students, I'd always mention a point Pincoffs makes here. Knowing is surely a part of expertise. Famous philosophers and scholars surely know a lot about morality. But I'd also want to know about their character, about their doing of morality. I'm a philosopher, so I come to the question predisposed to think highly of thinking and knowing. But also, given the subject at hand, I'm also strongly inclined to value doing over knowing. Unlike Pincoffs, I'm open to the real possibility of there being moral experts. I would find these in the moral exemplars who, by the way they live, demonstrate the nature of the good life, and through their communications, show ways the good life can be achieved. I have another difference with positions developed in many of these student papers. Many rejected the possibility of moral expertise because no one is perfect. I've just said that doing is an essential part of moral expertise. I don't believe, however, that perfection is necessary. Turning back to Pincoffs' own metaphor of moral reasoning as weaving and mending nets, I'd say the moral expert is skilled at weaving the net and at recognizing errors she has made and then mending the net. What do you think? Are you open to the possibility of moral experts? Why or why not? Pincoffs continues his consideration of necessary roles for both moral performance and reasoning on page 4. He says, moral character and moral judgment are far more intimately bound together than theory advocates can allow. Moral judgment is an expression of the character of the person who offers it. Character, built on what we do, on how we live, comes from our moral judgments and influences our moral judgments. If we have good character, we're more likely to make good moral judgments. If we make good moral judgments, we will build good character. The causality runs both directions. Later on, page 4, he says that three criticisms will be offered. The first is that there is no good reason to suppose that the subject of ethics need be confined to the resolution of difficult problems by the application of theory. There we are with the quandary bit. It goes on also, the second and third question, the relevance of theories to problems and the claimed justificatory powers of ethical theories. It's another way of saying that he's rejecting not just the centrality of quandaries, the resolution of difficult problems, but also reductionistic use of theories in moral reasoning. Pincoffs turns to the problem of reductionism directly on page 5. He writes, if the cardinal sin of ethical theories is that they are reductive, that they eliminate by fiat what is morally relevant and legislate the form of moral reflection, then the question is whether a non-reductive discipline of ethics is the question of what account of morality can be offered that gives character its due. An answer to both of these questions is that the primary business of ethics ought to be with qualities of character, with the virtues and the vices. Two things I see here. First, there's the reductionism inherent in too many ethical theories. Pincoffs is arguing that we can't say universally and in advance what details will be relevant to our moral reasoning. Context is always important and always varies. Second, there's the concern that an ethics that considers character and the virtues important, asking what kind of person I am and what kind of person should I want to become, precede the question most modern ethical theories start with, what should I do? Answering the question, what should I do, depends on how we answer the prior questions of character. Some of you may detect what you consider a mistake here. You may be uncomfortable with the question, what kind of person should I want to become, given its obvious assumption of normativity. You might be more comfortable asking the narrower and more individualistic question, what kind of person do I want to become? On page 6, Pincoffs turns to considerations of metaphysics, both dimensions that deal with philosophical anthropology and those that deal with social ontology. He says, these uses of moral talk can, in turn, only be understood against a background of assumed facts about the common life of human beings. In the absence of those facts, these virtues have no place. They do not arise. Talk of them or reflection on them has no use. They do not exist. Are there facts of the matter when it comes to what he calls the common life of human beings? Are there legitimate ways to talk about human nature? Dorothy Sayers, a British writer of the mid-20th century, famously asked in one of her books, are women human? Her point was not to disparage women, but rather to investigate whether women are so different from men as to constitute a different species. She came down on the side of seeing a common human nature shared by men and women. Obviously, there are differences between women, qua women, and men, qua men, and additionally, plenty of differences from man to man and woman to woman. Nevertheless, Sayers argued that diversity, or better, these diversities, existed in the context of a shared humanity. There were facts about the common life of human beings, to use Pincoffs' language. Because there are facts about our common human nature, there are excellences, character qualities, for which we use the word virtues, that enable us to think about and pursue the good life together. Pincoffs and Sayers would agree on that. That there are facts about our common life is an area in which I agree with Pincoffs. The next area I see a disagreement. He says, my perspective is thus a functional one, but I want to clarify in what sense it is functional. It is often assumed that functionalism and teleology necessarily go together. I am a functionalist, but I'm not a teleologist. I think that if we are to understand moral talk and reflection, we must have some idea of their uses. But I do not want to issue pronouncements about the end of man. That there can be non-teleological functionalism can best be seen by another excursion into metaphor. The functionalist perspective is that of the engineer, rather than that of the captain of the ship. Wherever the captain may want to go, the engine and working parts of the ship must operate well if he is to get there. When we go back and consider Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, we see that he is committed to a teleological account of humans. Humans, qua humans, have a telos, an end, a purpose. Pincoffs, in the section I just quoted, explicitly rejects teleology. He is instead a functionalist. He sees that dimensions of human personality have functions. They can function more or less well. I'm more inclined toward teleology. What's decisive for me are some of my prior theological commitments and their anthropological entailments. I also differ from Aristotle, however, in that I'd be happier to describe the teleology of humans in terms of narrative, of story, of history, rather than metaphysics. In his Nicomachean Ethics, we see Aristotle's account and analysis of the virtues. Some of the character traits and dispositions he identifies as virtues seem strange to us. We might even think that some of the features he calls virtues look more like vices. Pincoffs recognizes the catalog of virtues and vices varies from culture to culture, and perhaps even from situation to situation. He says, what counts as a virtue or a vice will change, but there are limits. No one thinks that there will be a common human life in which justice, persistence, courage, and honesty will not be virtues, even though humility or aggressiveness, say, may be less appropriate in one era than in another. What do you think? Are there some virtues that you think should be honored as virtues in all cultures and settings? If so, which would you include in such a list? And also, are there any virtues that you think are especially called upon in our era, perhaps even in your own context? When we get to page 8, we find Pincoffs turning explicitly to the question of individualism and social ontology. One of the features of modern philosophy that commonly differentiates it from pre-modern and postmodern philosophies is atomistic individualism. Part of this probably comes from the rediscovery of ancient Epicureanism in the 15th century and the development of that way of thinking in science and political thought. Pincoffs writes, there is another advantage in this common life, functional perspective on moral thought and talk. It supplies an antidote to the kind of abstract individualism that characterizes too much of ethical thought. Individualism makes sense only against a background of social organization. There is no human situation that consists of an aggregate of unrelated individuals. We are social beings. We come into a world that is already organized. We are creatures of organization. We live in each other's lives. We understand ourselves through our reflection in the perceptions of others. We die in the lives of others. Having been born, raised, and enculturated in an individualistic age, it's difficult to not be an individualist. It comes so naturally to us. We think the individual is logically prior to social institutions like marriages, families, businesses, colleges, churches, unions, even friendship. As modern individualists, we have trouble conceiving of these possessing any ontological status other than as connections chosen by individuals. Pincoffs continues, modern ethical theories typically suppose, and explicitly in contract theory, that the most fundamental level of the human situation is an individualistic one in which there is either, as in Hobbes, a threat of war of all against all, or in which, as in Rousseau, noble savages live free and independent lives, associating only for matters of individual convenience. In Kant, the individual wrestles alone with his conscience and legislates freely for himself, indeed universalizing for an aggregation of other imagined individuals, but only in the interest of non-contradiction in his own will. Mill's individual is an instrument for the common good, valuable only to the extent that he is effective in that single role, which is not a social role, but a causal designation. I have to say that I consider myself a recovering individualist. I feel the pull of individualism in my very bones. But when I consider the kind of person I want to be and my intellectual commitments to the way the world and its inhabitants are, I push against it. With Pincoffs, I push back against the forces aligned with Hobbes, Rousseau, Kant, and Mill. Pincoffs doesn't use the term social ontology. That's what he's talking about when he says of modern individualism, it rests on an unsupported and misleading premise that the realm of ethics is at bottom a realm of non-socially organized individuals, that social organization is not as much a fundamental aspect of the human situation as is gravity or the helplessness of a newborn child. It is a misleading premise because it so effectively obscures the meaning of what has a far stronger claim to be at the foundation of ethical thought, the fact that we must live together. We must live with each other in as effective, meaningful, fruitful, and harmonious a way as possible. Now, much of our modern way of thinking about things has been influenced by Descartes. In his quest for epistemological certainty, Descartes doubted everything he could until he came to a single thing he could not doubt. You maybe heard of the cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. The one thing he could not doubt was that he was thinking. On the foundation of this, I think, he built the entire superstructure of certain knowledge. As I said earlier, this foundationalist approach to knowledge has mostly failed over the centuries. It has left us with the assumption, however, that the best model for real knowledge is our knowledge of ourselves, and that we know ourselves before anything else, since we have special interior access to ourselves. I understand why we think this way. It seems to come naturally and to be indubitable. But consider this question. How do I know my name? Is it through careful self-analysis of my consciousness, through my own self-knowledge that I come to know my name? Or have I, as a sovereign, autonomous self, simply named myself? For most of us, my guess is that we have names and know our names because we've been enmeshed in social contexts in which people call us by name. From earliest infancy, people are telling us our names. They are actively knowing us before we develop the capacity for knowing anything explicitly. Our self-knowledge is not only not independent, it is directly dependent on our experience of other people knowing us and on our living in those relationships. One more tiny little thing to consider in this chapter. On page 9, Pincoffs writes, to have a virtue is to have a desirable disposition of a certain sort. We've looked earlier at virtues as excellences of action. We've considered them as character qualities. Now he approaches them from a slightly different perspective, calling them desirable dispositions of a certain sort. What do you think he means by this? What is the nature of a disposition? The features that make a disposition a disposition? Given this definition, what are some virtues that you would find beneficial in your life.